Journey into the brutal reality behind history's most influential military mind. Before The Art of War became the world's most famous strategy manual, Sun Tzu was a man struggling to survive in China's bloodiest era, the Spring and Autumn period, where 7 kingdoms tore each other apart in an endless cycle of betrayal and slaughter. This isn't the sanitized legend you know from business seminars and motivational quotes. This is the true story of a warrior-philosopher who walked through fields of corpses, navigated deadly court conspiracies, and transformed the very nature of warfare itself. Discover the man behind the myth, the mysteries that still haunt historians, and the legacy that changed the world forever. They say Sun Tzu never lost a battle, but what they don't tell you is the price he paid for that perfection. In ancient China, during an era when kingdoms rose and fell like tides, when a single strategic mistake could mean the extinction of your entire family line, one man emerged who would change warfare forever. But before he became the legendary strategist whose words would echo through 25 centuries, before emperors and generals hung on his every word, Sun Tzu was just another soldier in a world drowning in blood. And the path to becoming history's greatest military mind would cost him everything he ever loved. This is not the story you think you know. This is the truth about Sun Tzu, a truth written in betrayal, genius, and the ashes of ancient kingdoms. Segment 1. Before the legend, life in the shadows. The year is approximately 544 BCE. The land that would one day be called China is not yet a unified empire. It is a fractured nightmare of warring states, each one clawing for survival in what historians call the Spring and Autumn period. 7 major kingdoms and dozens of smaller territories circle each other like starving wolves, their borders shifting with every season, their populations decimated by endless campaigns that begin with spring planting and end only when winter makes war impossible. This is the world into which Sun Wu is born, in the state of Qi, in what is now Shandong province. His name is not yet Sun Tzu. That title, meaning master's son, will come much later if he survives long enough to earn it. For now, he is simply the son of a minor aristocratic family, living in the shadow of war. The city where young Sun Wu grows up is surrounded by earthen walls 30 feet high, packed so hard they can withstand siege engines. But walls are only as strong as the men defending them, and men are in short supply. The previous year's campaign against the neighboring state of Lu claimed 20,000 lives. The year before that, it was Jin. Next year, it will be someone else. The cycle never ends. Inside his family compound, Sun Wu learns to sleep through the sound of soldiers marching past at dawn. The rhythmic thud of boots, the clatter of bronze armor, the commands barked in harsh dialects from a dozen different regions. These are the lullabies of his childhood. His family status affords them some protection, but not much. They have servants, but the servants are thin. They have guards, but the guards are old or crippled, the able-bodied men all conscripted for the king's armies. His father is a minor military officer, a man with ambitions that outweigh his achievements. In the evenings, by the light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls painted with protective symbols, his father studies ancient military texts and mutters about the incompetence of the current generals. Sun Wu watches, absorbing everything, learning that in this world, military knowledge is the only currency that matters. The winters are brutal. The compound's heating comes from small braziers that barely warm a single room. Sun Wu learns to sleep fully clothed, wrapped in layers of rough silk and whatever furs the family can afford. Some mornings, he wakes to find ice crystals forming on the inside of his chamber walls. On the worst nights, he can hear the cries of the poor freezing to death in the streets beyond the compound walls. Food is never certain. Even for an aristocratic family, meals depend on what the tax collectors can extract from peasants who have already given too much. Rice becomes a luxury. Millet and coarse vegetables become the standard. During the worst shortages, even those run out. Sun Wu learns early that hunger is not just discomfort. It is a strategic factor, a weapon that can break armies and topple kingdoms. His education begins at age 7, which is considered late in an era where life expectancy rarely exceeds 40 years. A tutor arrives, an elderly scholar who survived 3 different dynastic purges by keeping his head down and his opinions flexible. The man teaches Sun Tzu the classics, the ancient texts that every educated person must know. But more importantly, he teaches the boy to read the spaces between the words, to understand that every text is written with an agenda, that truth is always filtered through the perspective of power. Military training begins at age 10. This is not the romanticized martial arts of later legends. This is practical, brutal preparation for the reality of Bronze Age warfare. Sun Tzu learns to march in formation for hours without breaking step, because battles are won by disciplined units, not individual heroes. He learns to thrust with a dagger axe, the primary infantry weapon of the era, a long pole with a bronze blade designed to hook and tear at an enemy's neck or limbs. The training dummies are stuffed with straw and wrapped in old leather, but Sun Tzu is taught to imagine them as real men, to aim for the throat, the armpit, the groin, anywhere the armor doesn't protect. The practice yard is a rectangle of hard-packed earth behind the family compound. In summer, the dust chokes every breath. In winter, the ground freezes so hard that falling feels like hitting stone. Sun Tzu trains alongside other aristocratic boys, but also with commoners, the sons of servants and merchants who show promise. This mixing of classes is unusual, pragmatic. She needs soldiers more than it needs rigid social structures. The training master is a scarred veteran named Tian, who lost his left eye at the Battle of Yen and whose right leg never healed properly from a spear wound. He walks with a distinctive hitch, and the boys learn to recognize his approach by that uneven footfall. Tian is not cruel, but he is utterly unsentimental. He teaches them that pain is just information, that fear is the enemy, that the moment you hesitate in battle is the moment you die. During one training session, when Sun Tzu is 12, Tian stops the drill and calls the boys to gather around. He points to a scar on his forearm, a thick rope of tissue that runs from wrist to elbow. "I got this at the Huai River crossing," he says. "We were retreating, which means we had already lost. The enemy cavalry caught us at the ford. My shield arm was already numb from holding it up for 6 hours. When the horsemen came at me, I raised the shield too slow. His lance went past it and tore open my arm from here to here. I could see the bone. I could see the muscle twitching. The boys are silent, transfixed. I killed him anyway," Tian continues. "Not because I was brave, because I was too terrified to run. Fear kept me alive that day. Remember that. Courage is useful, but terror is reliable." Sun Tzu never forgets this lesson. He also learns the administrative side of warfare, the logistics that most aristocratic boys find boring, but that will later define his genius. How many pounds of grain does an army of 10,000 men consume per day? How many wagons are needed to transport that grain? How many men to guard those wagons? How many horses can be sustained on local forage versus how many need to be fed from supplies? These calculations seem abstract until Tian explains. Every army that ever starved to death had brave soldiers. Bravery doesn't matter if your supply line breaks. At 13, Sun Tzu witnesses his first real violence. Not training, not stories, actual death. A border skirmish spills into Qi territory, and refugees flood into the city. Among them are wounded soldiers, men with injuries that no amount of silk bandages and herbal poultices can heal. The family compound is pressed into service as a temporary hospital. Sun Tzu is assigned to help the physicians, which mostly means holding men down while their shattered limbs are amputated without anesthesia beyond rice wine and opium. The screaming is worse than anything he imagined. But worse than the screaming is what comes after. The silence, when a man's body realizes it's dying and simply stops fighting. Sun Tzu watches life leave human eyes and understands, in a way no text could teach him, that war is not glorious. It is not even particularly heroic. It is industrial-scale butchery, and the only difference between victory and defeat is who runs out of men first. One soldier, a captain named Zhao, survives his wounds but loses both legs below the knee. While recovering, he talks to Sun Tzu, perhaps because the boy is one of the few people who doesn't look at him with pity or disgust. Zhao tells him about the battle, about how they were ambushed because their scout reports were 3 days old, about how the general refused to retreat even when the position was clearly lost, about how 2,000 men died to preserve one man's pride. The stupidest part, Zhao says, his voice hoarse from screaming during the amputation, is that we would have died for him anyway. If he'd asked us to hold the line for a strategic reason, we'd have done it. But he kept us there because he couldn't admit he'd made a mistake. That's what kills most soldiers, not the enemy, but the ego of their own commanders. This conversation plants a seed in Sun Tzu's mind that will eventually blossom into one of the core principles of the art of war, that a general must be flexible, must be willing to retreat, must prioritize victory over pride. At 15, Sun Tzu's childhood effectively ends. His father secures him a position as a junior officer in the Qi army, which is both an honor and a death sentence. Life expectancy for junior officers is measured in campaigns, not years. But this is also the only path forward for someone of his class and ambition. The alternative is to remain in the capital, scrambling for minor bureaucratic posts, slowly fading into irrelevance. The night before he leaves, his mother gives him an amulet, a small jade piece carved with protective symbols. She doesn't speak, because there's nothing to say. They both know he might not return. In this era, war doesn't take vacations. It is the permanent condition of existence. Sun Tzu reports to the army camp outside the city walls. The camp is a sprawling mess of tents, supply wagons, and training grounds. The smell hits him first. 10,000 men living in close quarters, inadequate sanitation, the sour tang of fear sweat that no amount of washing can remove. His aristocratic education and family name mean nothing here. He is assigned to a unit of 200 infantry, given a worn leather armor that doesn't fit properly, and told to keep up or die. The men in his unit are from everywhere. Peasants conscripted from their farms, petty criminals given a choice between execution and military service, veterans who have nowhere else to go. They range in age from 15 to 50, which is ancient for a soldier. Many have missing teeth, old injuries that never healed right, the hollow eyes of men who have seen things that can't be unseen. His first campaign is against the state of Lu, a conflict over water rights and border territories that has been reignited for the 7th time in 20 years. The army marches for 12 days to reach the contested region. Sun Tzu learns that military marches are nothing like training drills. Men fall out with blisters, dysentery, heat exhaustion. The baggage train stretches for miles, vulnerable to raiders. At night, they camp in rough formations, and Sun Tzu learns to sleep with his hand on his weapon because night attacks are common. The battle itself is almost anticlimactic. Two armies face each other across a field. Commanders shout. Drums beat. Then thousands of men rush together and begin killing each other with bronze weapons and desperate brutality. There is no strategy visible from Sun Tzu's position in the middle ranks. There is only chaos, the man beside him falling with a spear in his throat, the enemy soldier whose face Sun Tzu will remember forever as he drives his dagger axe into the man's chest, the terrible sound of his own labored breathing inside a helmet that restricts his vision to a narrow slit. Qi wins. Lu retreats. The cost is 800 dead on Qi's side, an acceptable ratio according to the generals. Sun Tzu survives without serious injury, though his armor is dented and stained with blood that isn't his. That night, the army celebrates. Sun Tzu sits apart, unable to eat, replaying the moment of killing over and over in his mind. An older soldier, a man named Wei with gray in his beard and scars across both hands, sits down beside him. First one, he asks. Sun Tzu nods. It doesn't get easier, Wei says. Anyone who tells you it does is lying or broken, but you do learn to carry it. And you learn to make sure the other man is the first one, not you. Over the next 3 years, Sun Tzu participates in 6 more campaigns. He learns to read terrain the way other men read texts. He learns which generals are competent and which are incompetent. He learns that most battles are decided by logistics and morale long before the actual fighting begins. He learns that the side with better intelligence, better supply lines, and better discipline wins, not the side with braver soldiers or more inspiring speeches. He also learns that military service is filled with waste, wasted lives, wasted resources, wasted opportunities. He watches generals commit the same mistakes repeatedly because tradition demands certain tactics, even when those tactics no longer work. He watches men die in battles that achieve nothing, in wars that solve no problems, in conflicts that generate only more conflicts. During a long winter encampment, Sun Tzu begins writing. Nothing formal, just notes, observations, questions. What makes one general successful and another fail? Why do some armies hold together under pressure while others collapse? How much of warfare is chance versus skill? These notes, written on bamboo strips by candlelight in a freezing tent, are the first fragments of what will eventually become the art of war. But that transformation is still years away. For now, Sun Tzu is just another junior officer in an army that has too many wars and too few answers. He is competent, promising, but not yet exceptional. The world does not yet know his name. He is still living in the shadows, waiting for the moment that will pull him into the light. That moment is coming, but it will arrive wrapped in betrayal, tragedy, and a political crisis that will force Sun Tzu to make a choice: remain safely obscure or step onto the stage of history and risk everything. The decision will define the rest of his life. Segment 2. Rise of the Warrior, the Path to Glory. The turning point comes in 517 BCE, when Sun Tzu is 27 years old. The state of Qi, which has been his home and his employer, tears itself apart in a political crisis that will later be known as the Bao Clan Rebellion. The details are complex, involving court factions, disputed succession, and the ambitions of powerful aristocratic families. But for Sun Tzu, the relevant fact is simple: his family chooses the losing side. When the dust settles and the victorious faction begins its purges, Sun Tzu faces a stark choice. He can remain in Qi and hope his relatively minor status keeps him off the execution lists, or he can flee and start over somewhere else. The decision is made for him when one of his father's political enemies begins arresting anyone associated with the defeated faction. Sun Tzu's name appears on a warrant list. He leaves Qi in the middle of the night with nothing but his weapons, his armor, and those bamboo strips covered in his military observations. His family's compound is seized. His father is executed. His mother and siblings disappear into the chaos of civil war, their fates unknown, possibly dead, possibly enslaved, possibly just lost in the masses of displaced people flooding across state borders. Sun Tzu becomes a refugee. For a man who has spent his entire life as part of the military aristocracy, the fall is vertiginous. He travels south, avoiding main roads, sleeping in forests and abandoned buildings. His military training keeps him alive. He knows how to forage, how to move without being detected, how to recognize danger before it materializes. After weeks of travel, he reaches the state of Wu, located in what is now southern Jiangsu province. Wu is smaller than Qi but ambitious, a rising power with a competent ruler named King Helu and a hunger for expansion. More importantly, Wu has no particular grudge against refugees from Qi. They ask questions, but they are looking for spies and saboteurs, not fugitive junior officers. Sun Tzu provides a false name, claims to be a merchant's son fleeing the instability, and finds work as a guard for a trading company. For 2 years, he lives in obscurity. He guards warehouses. He escorts trade caravans. He keeps his military expertise hidden because advertising it would raise questions about his past. During this time, he continues his writing, expanding his observations into something more systematic. He studies the campaigns of ancient generals, analyzes historical battles, and begins to formulate theories about the nature of warfare that go beyond simple tactics. This period of obscurity is perhaps the most important of his life. Stripped of status and identity, forced to survive by his wits, Sun Tzu has time to think in ways that busy aristocrats and active duty officers rarely do. He comes to understand that war is not primarily about fighting. It is about creating conditions where fighting is unnecessary or where the outcome is predetermined. This insight, radical for its time, will become the foundation of his entire philosophy. His return to military life comes through an unexpected connection. One of the men he guards caravans with is a former Wu army officer named Sun Tzu. Confusingly, this man shares a similar name, but is a different person entirely. Sun Tzu recognizes Sun Tzu's competence, the way he positions guards, the efficiency of his route planning, the instinctive tactical awareness that no merchant's son would possess. Over cups of wine one evening, Sun Tzu asks direct questions. Sun Tzu, calculating that Wu is far enough from Qi that his past no longer matters, tells a version of the truth. Sun Tzu has connections. One of them is Gong Sun Hui, a minor official in the Wu court who is always looking for capable men. An introduction is arranged. Sun Wu meets Gong Sun Hui at a tea house near the river, a neutral location where both men can speak frankly. Gong Sun Hui is in his 50s, a career bureaucrat with sharp eyes and a reputation for spotting talent. He listens to Sun Wu's carefully edited life story, asks pointed questions about military theory, and then produces a map of Wu's current border disputes. "Advise me," he says. "If you were planning a campaign against Chu, Wu's much larger neighbor to the west, how would you proceed?" Most men would propose direct strategies: where to attack, what forces to use. Sun Wu does something different. He asks about Chu's internal politics, their supply vulnerabilities, their relationships with other states. He asks about the season, the weather patterns, the condition of the roads. Only after gathering information does he suggest an approach: don't attack Chu directly. Instead, raid their tributaries, disrupt their trade routes, force them to disperse their forces across multiple fronts. Then, when they are stretched thin and economically weakened, strike at their exposed supply lines. Gong Sun Hui leans back, studying Sun Wu with new interest. "You've read Sun Bin's work," he says, naming an ancient military theorist. "I've read it," Sun Wu replies. "I disagree with most of it." This could be a dangerous statement. Sun Bin is revered. But Gong Sun Hui smiles. Why? Because Sun Bin assumes resources are unlimited. He plans campaigns the way someone would plan a chess game, moving pieces without considering what each move costs. Real warfare is constrained by logistics, by economics, by the limits of human endurance. A strategy that ignores those constraints is a fantasy. This conversation changes Sun Wu's life. Gong Sun Hui arranges a meeting with King Helu himself, an almost unheard-of opportunity for someone with no official credentials or aristocratic backing. The meeting is brief, formal, and decisive. King Helu has been looking for new military advisors, dissatisfied with the conventional thinking of his current generals. He asks Sun Wu a single question: "Can you train my army to fight in ways my enemies cannot predict?" Sun Wu responds carefully: "I can train your army to win without fighting, or to fight only when victory is already assured. If you want innovation, I can provide it, but it will require trusting methods that contradict tradition." King Helu considers this. In an era where military doctrine is rigidly traditional, where generals are expected to follow ancient precedents, this is a radical offer. But Helu is ambitious and pragmatic. "Show me," he says. Sun Wu is given a test. King Helu orders him to train a unit of the palace women, concubines and servants, in military drill. This is both an impossible task and a deliberate humiliation. Women do not serve in armies. Training them is a joke, a way to expose Sun Wu as a fraud before granting him any real authority. What happens next becomes one of the most famous stories in Chinese military history, though the details are probably embellished. Sun Wu accepts the challenge without protest. He divides the women into two companies, appoints the king's two favorite concubines as commanders, and explains the drill commands. The women laugh, treat it as a game. Sun Wu repeats the commands. The women continue laughing. Then Sun Wu does something unexpected. He declares that the commanders have failed to maintain discipline and must be executed according to military law. The king, watching from a pavilion, sends a message: "These are my favorites, do not harm them." Sun Wu sends back a message: "A general in the field cannot be bound by the ruler's personal preferences. If you want a disciplined army, the law must apply equally." He executes both women. The laughter stops immediately. The remaining women perform every drill perfectly. King Helu is horrified, furious, and impressed. The demonstration proves that Sun Wu understands the fundamental principle of military discipline. Consequences must be real, immediate, and impartial. Without that, no army can function. King Helu appoints Sun Wu as a senior military advisor, a position of considerable power and danger. Sun Wu is now responsible for planning Wu's campaigns, training its officers, and reforming its military structure. He has gone from refugee to strategist in less than 3 years, but the position comes with existential risk. Success will bring glory. Failure will bring execution. His first campaign is against the state of Chu, the larger neighbor that has dominated Wu for generations. Traditional strategy would suggest this is impossible. Chu has 10 times Wu's population and a battle-hardened army. But Sun Wu does not plan a traditional campaign. Instead, He implements a strategy of exhaustion. Wu raids Chu's border territories, strikes supply depots, ambushes isolated units, and then retreats before Chu can mobilize a response. This continues for months, bleeding Chu's resources and morale without committing to a decisive battle. Chu's generals, trained in conventional warfare, become frustrated. They demand a major engagement where their superior numbers can decide the outcome. Sun Wu refuses to give them one. He understands something that most generals of his era do not, that refusing to fight is itself a tactic, that patience is a weapon, that the army which can choose when and where to engage holds the ultimate advantage. Finally, after months of raiding, Chu commits a critical mistake. Frustrated by Wu's hit-and-run tactics, they split their army to guard multiple fronts simultaneously. Sun Wu has been waiting for this moment. He concentrates Wu's forces and strikes at one of Chu's now undermanned positions, achieves a quick victory, and retreats before Chu's other forces can respond. The battle lasts half a day. Wu suffers minimal casualties. Chu loses 3,000 men and, more importantly, the psychological advantage. This campaign establishes Sun Wu's reputation. He has defeated a superior enemy not through courage or luck, but through systematic application of strategic principles. King Helu is delighted. Other states begin to take Wu seriously as a military power. Sun Wu is granted land, titles, and resources to continue his work. But success brings new challenges. The traditional generals in Wu's court resent this outsider who contradicts their methods. They circulate rumors that Sun Wu is a coward who avoids battle, that his strategies dishonor Wu's martial traditions, that foreigners cannot be trusted. Some of this is xenophobia. Much of it is professional jealousy. All of it is dangerous. Sun Wu responds not with politics, but with results. Over the next 6 years, he plans and executes 5 more campaigns against Chu and 2 against smaller neighboring states. Wu wins every one, not through miraculous victories or heroic charges, but through meticulous preparation, intelligence gathering, and the ruthless exploitation of enemy weaknesses. Sun Wu develops a network of spies in enemy states. He maps supply routes and identifies choke points. He trains Wu's officers in his methods, creating a generation of commanders who think strategically rather than just tactically. During this period, he also completes his written work. What began as scattered observations on bamboo strips becomes a systematic treatise organized into 13 chapters. He covers everything from strategic planning to terrain analysis, from the use of spies to the management of alliances. Most radically, he argues that the highest form of military skill is winning without fighting, achieving political objectives through intimidation, deception, and the strategic positioning of forces such that actual combat becomes unnecessary. This text is not published in any modern sense. Instead, Sun Wu presents it to King Helu as a private military manual, a guide for Wu's strategic planning. Helu recognizes its value and restricts access to his inner circle. For years, the art of war is a state secret, an advantage that Wu has over its rivals. But manuscripts circulate. Copies are made. Captured enemy officers mention rumors of Wu's mysterious strategic text. Within a generation, versions of Sun Wu's works spread across the warring states, copied by hand, memorized by ambitious officers, debated by military scholars. The text becomes famous not because of marketing or royal decree, but because it works. Generals who apply its principles win. Those who ignore it lose. Sun Wu himself becomes a legend, though the man behind the legend remains guarded and private. He rarely appears in court, preferring to work from his estate outside the capital. When he does appear, he speaks little, observing more than participating. He has learned from his family's destruction that politics is more dangerous than warfare. The wise strategist, he understands, makes himself useful but not threatening, valuable but not irreplaceable. In 506 BCE, Sun Wu plans his masterpiece, the invasion and temporary conquest of Chu's capital. This is a campaign that should be impossible. Chu is still much larger than Wu. Their capital is heavily fortified and located deep in their territory. No enemy has ever successfully taken it. But Sun Wu sees an opportunity that others miss. Chu's army is deployed far to the north, engaged in a campaign against another state. Their capital is defended primarily by local garrisons and the assumption that no one would dare attack it. Sun Wu proposes a rapid strike, a forced march that bypasses Chu's armies entirely and goes straight for the capital. It is risky, bordering on reckless. The supply lines will be dangerously extended. If Chu's armies return quickly, Wu's forces will be trapped. But Sun Wu has done his intelligence work. He knows the terrain, the roads, the timing of Chu's troop movements. He knows that Chu's generals, operating under conventional assumptions, will not believe Wu would attempt something so audacious. King Helu approves the plan. The campaign launches in early spring, when roads are still muddy but passable. Wu's army moves faster than anyone expects, covering distances that conventional military wisdom says are impossible. They reach Chu's capital before the defenders realize what is happening. The siege is brief. The city falls. Wu occupies Chu's capital for 3 months. This is not a permanent conquest. Sun Wu knows Wu lacks the resources to hold the territory. But the psychological impact is devastating. Chu, the dominant power of the region, has been humiliated. Their king flees. Their government collapses into chaos. When Wu finally withdraws, Chu is permanently weakened, no longer the threat it once was. This campaign establishes Sun Wu as perhaps the greatest strategist of his era. His methods, speed, deception, strategic surprise, the psychological component of warfare, are studied and imitated across all the warring states. He has demonstrated that intelligence and planning can overcome superior numbers, that creativity defeats convention, that the mind is a more powerful weapon than the sword. But Sun Wu understands something that his admirers do not. Success is temporary, and nothing lasts forever. By 505 BCE, he is in his late 40s, ancient by the standards of his time. His health, never robust after years of campaigning, begins to fail. More importantly, King Helu's health fails. When Helu dies and his son Fuchai takes the throne, Sun Wu finds himself in a dangerous position. The new king respects his father's advisors but wants to establish his own authority, his own circle of trusted men. Sun Wu reads the situation clearly. He could fight for influence, compete with younger advisors, try to maintain his position through political maneuvering. But that is not his nature, and history is littered with the corpses of advisors who tried to remain indispensable. Instead, he does something unexpected. He retires. He withdraws to his estate, claims illness, and removes himself from active involvement in Wu's military planning. This is not cowardice or defeat. It is strategy. By stepping back voluntarily, he preserves his reputation and his life. He becomes a legend who retired at the peak of his powers, rather than an old man clinging to fading relevance. From his estate, he watches as Wu continues its rise, applying his methods even in his absence. He watches as other states adopt and adapt his strategies. He watches as warfare itself begins to change, becoming more sophisticated, more psychological, more strategic. He has fundamentally altered how his civilization thinks about conflict. He spends his final years revising and expanding his text, adding observations based on his campaigns, refining his theories. He knows that this work, more than any battle he won, will be his true legacy. Victories are forgotten. Kingdoms fall. But ideas, if they are powerful enough, endure. Sun Wu dies sometime around 496 BCE, at approximately 48 years old. His death is not recorded with fanfare or ceremony. He simply fades from the historical record, as he preferred. He is buried near his estate, without an elaborate tomb or grand memorial. For a man who changed the nature of warfare, the ending is remarkably quiet. But the legend is just beginning. Segment 3. Myths, Secrets, and Unsolved Mysteries. More than 2,000 years after his death, Sun Tzu remains one of history's most enigmatic figures. The man behind the legend is obscured by time, myth, and the deliberate silences of history. Entire schools of historical thought have questioned whether he even existed as a single individual or whether Sun Tzu is a pseudonym for multiple authors working over generations. The mysteries surrounding him are not just biographical curiosities. They touch on fundamental questions about authorship, authenticity, and how knowledge is transmitted across centuries. The first mystery is his name itself. Sun Tzu, or Sun Tzu, is a title, not a personal name. It means Master Sun or Old Master Sunday. His personal name is given in various historical sources as Sun Wu, but even this is uncertain. Ancient Chinese naming conventions were complex, with individuals bearing multiple names used in different contexts. The man we call Sun Tzu might have been known by entirely different names to his contemporaries. This ambiguity is not accidental. In ancient China, revealing one's true name was considered magically dangerous, giving others power over you. Military strategists, dealing in deception and misdirection, were particularly protective of their identities. Some historians argue that Sun Tzu never existed as an individual at all. They point to the text of The Art of War and note inconsistencies in style, vocabulary, and philosophical assumptions that suggest multiple authors. Perhaps, they argue, Sun Tzu is a literary construct, a fictional sage created to give authority to a text compiled from various military traditions. This theory gained traction in the early 20th century, when Chinese scholars, influenced by Western textual criticism, began applying rigorous analysis to their own classics. The counterargument came in 1972, when Chinese archaeologists excavated a tomb in Linyi, Shandong province. Among the artifacts was a bamboo strip manuscript of The Art of War, dating to approximately 134 to 118 BCE, making it the oldest physical copy ever discovered. The text is substantially similar to later versions, suggesting a stable transmission across centuries. More importantly, the tomb also contained historical documents that corroborated some details of Sun Tzu's biography mentioned in ancient histories. While this doesn't definitively prove Sun Tzu existed, it strongly suggests that by the 2nd century BCE, he was considered a historical figure rather than a myth. But this discovery raises as many questions as it answers. If Sun Tzu was real, why is his biography so sparse in contemporary records? The Spring and Autumn Annals, the primary historical chronicle of his era, never mentions him. The works of Confucius and other philosophers active during his lifetime contain no reference to a revolutionary military thinker. It's as if Sun Tzu operated in the shadows of history, leaving almost no trace except for his text. One possibility is that Sun Tzu's work was deliberately suppressed or restricted. In the competitive environment of the warring states, a truly effective strategic manual would be treated as a state secret, not publicized. King Helu of Wu would have had every reason to prevent Sun Tzu's methods from becoming widely known. The text might have circulated only among a small elite for generations before eventually spreading through captured copies, defecting officers, and the gradual breakdown of Wu's security systems. Another mystery concerns Sun Tzu's military record. Ancient histories credit him with perfect success. He never lost a battle. This is almost certainly an exaggeration, the kind of posthumous perfection that accumulates around legendary figures. But even allowing for exaggeration, Sun Tzu's strategic record was remarkably successful. The question is, how? What specific insights or methods allowed him to consistently outthink his opponents? Some scholars point to his possible use of espionage and intelligence gathering, which was revolutionary for his era. Chapter 13 of The Art of War, titled The Use of Spies, is the longest and most detailed chapter in the entire text. Sun Tzu categorizes 5 types of spies and explains how to employ each. He advocates spending enormous resources on intelligence, arguing that the cost of spies is negligible compared to the cost of armies. This suggests that Sun Tzu won not through superior tactics on the battlefield, but through superior information before the battle even began. Archaeological evidence supports this. Excavations of spring and autumn period military sites reveal sophisticated signal systems, courier networks, and what appear to be early forms of cryptography, methods for encoding military messages. Wu, during Sun Tzu's era, appears to have invested heavily in these systems, suggesting that his advocacy for intelligence gathering was implemented at a state level. There is also the mystery of Sun Tzu's disappearance from the historical record. After his apparent retirement around 505 BCE, he simply vanishes. No death date is recorded with certainty. No tomb has been definitively identified as his. Some legends claim he lived into his 70s, extremely old by ancient standards, and died peacefully. Others suggest he was assassinated by political rivals, his body disposed of secretly to prevent his burial site from becoming a rallying point for his followers. The most intriguing legend, recorded in some later texts but impossible to verify, claims that Sun Tzu faked his own death and disappeared into the mountains, becoming a hermit philosopher who trained a select few students in his methods. This story, while almost certainly fictional, reflects the aura of mystery that has always surrounded him. The sense that there is a secret knowledge, a deeper level of understanding, that Sun Tzu possessed but only partially revealed in his text. One of the most persistent mysteries concerns what Sun Tzu didn't write about. The Art of War is remarkably brief, only about 6,000 Chinese characters in its original form, which translates to roughly 10 to 12,000 words in English. For comparison, modern military manuals run to hundreds of pages. What did Sun Tzu know that he didn't include? Were there other writings, now lost? Did he deliberately obscure certain knowledge, revealing only enough to be useful, but not enough to be dangerous in the wrong hands? Some scholars believe there were other texts. Medieval Chinese bibliographies mention works attributed to Sun Tzu that no longer exist, treatises on astronomy, calendrics, and divination as they relate to military campaigns. These subjects were considered essential for generals in ancient China, as the timing of campaigns was determined by both practical considerations, seasons, weather, and cosmological ones, auspicious dates, alignment of celestial forces. If Sun Tzu wrote about these topics, those writings have been lost, leaving us with only a fragment of his complete intellectual output. The text we do have contains passages that remain enigmatic even after centuries of commentary. Take, for example, his statement, "All warfare is based on deception." This seems straightforward, but the Chinese character used for deception carries connotations that don't translate cleanly. It suggests illusion, misdirection, the creation of false realities. Sun Tzu isn't just advocating for lying to enemies. He's describing a kind of ontological warfare where the battlefield itself becomes uncertain, where perception and reality diverge, where the enemy doesn't just lose, but becomes unable to determine what truth is. This philosophical depth has led some scholars to argue that The Art of War is not primarily a military text at all, but a work of Taoist philosophy disguised as a military manual. The emphasis on yielding, on using the enemy's force against them, on achieving victory through non-action, these are all central Taoist concepts. Sun Tzu's famous dictum that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting could be read as a Taoist teaching about working with natural forces rather than against them. But this interpretation raises questions about Sun Tzu's relationship to the religious and philosophical movements of his time. Was he influenced by Laozi, the semi-legendary founder of Taoism? The chronology is uncertain. We don't know precisely when either man lived or whether they could have interacted. Some traditions claim they were contemporaries. Others place them generations apart. There are even legends, recorded in much later sources, that Sun Tzu met Laozi once. A brief encounter on a mountain path where they discussed the nature of conflict and harmony. This meeting almost certainly never happened, but the legend reflects a persistent sense that these two thinkers were operating in the same intellectual universe. Another unsolved mystery concerns the transmission of the text itself. How did The Art of War survive? Many texts from the spring and autumn period were lost in the chaos of subsequent wars, in the famous burning of books under Qin Shi Huang in 213 BCE, or simply through the gradual decay of bamboo strip manuscripts. Sun Tzu's work survived, but the path of its survival is murky. The earliest confirmed mention of The Art of War as a complete text comes from Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, written around 91 BC, more than 400 years after Sun Tzu's death. Sima Qian includes a brief biography of Sun Tzu, but notes that different versions of the text were circulating, with varying numbers of chapters and significant textual variations. This suggests that by the 1st century BCE, The Art of War existed in multiple traditions, preserved by different schools or military families, each with their own editorial choices and interpretations. The standardization of the text probably occurred during the Han Dynasty, when imperial scholars attempted to collect and authenticate ancient classics. The version that has come down to us, 13 chapters with specific subdivisions, is likely the result of this editorial process. But what was lost in the standardization? Were there sections deemed too dangerous, too controversial, or simply too obscure to include? We will never know. One of the most tantalizing mysteries involves Sun Tzu's possible influence on other cultures. The Art of War was translated into Mongolian in the 13th century and may have influenced Genghis Khan's military campaigns. It was translated into Japanese in the 8th century and became foundational to samurai strategic thinking. But were there even earlier transmissions? Some scholars have noted similarities between Sun Tzu's principles and certain Roman military practices, particularly the emphasis on logistics and intelligence gathering. Could Sun Tzu's ideas have traveled the Silk Road, reaching west through chains of translation and adaptation? The evidence is circumstantial at best, but the possibility is fascinating. There is also the mystery of why Sun Tzu's ideas remained relevant across such different eras and cultures. The Art of War was written for Bronze Age warfare, massed infantry formations, limited communications, campaigns constrained by seasonal agriculture. Yet the text has been applied to everything from Napoleonic warfare to modern business strategy to nuclear deterrence theory. How can principles developed for ancient Chinese kingdoms remain applicable to fighter jets and corporate mergers? Either Sun Tzu discovered genuinely universal principles of conflict, or later readers are projecting meanings onto the text that he never intended. Finally, there is the personal mystery of Sun Tzu himself, the question of who he was as a human being. The text reveals a mind that is simultaneously ruthless and deeply humane, that advocates for minimal bloodshed while acknowledging war's brutal necessities. What experiences shaped that mindset? What did Sun Tzu witness that led him to conclude that the highest military skill was avoiding battle entirely? The text never becomes personal, never reveals the man behind the strategy. We don't know if he was married, if he had children, what he did in his hours away from military planning. We don't know what he looked like, what his voice sounded like, whether he laughed or kept his emotions locked away. Traditional Chinese portraits of Sun Tzu show a dignified elderly man with a long beard, wearing the robes of a scholar official. But these images date from more than 1,000 years after his death and represent not the man but the legend, the wise sage dispensing timeless wisdom. The real Sun Tzu, the man who walked through fields of corpses and made calculations that sent thousands to their deaths, remains hidden. Perhaps that's appropriate. Sun Tzu's entire philosophy revolves around concealment, about not revealing your true intentions or capabilities. He taught that the perfect strategist is invisible, that the greatest victories are those where the enemy doesn't even realize they've been defeated. Maybe his greatest strategic achievement was concealing himself so thoroughly that even 2.5 millennia later, we're still trying to figure out who he really was. The search continues. Modern archaeologists still hope to discover new manuscripts, new artifacts, new evidence that might fill in the gaps. Each excavation of spring and autumn period sites carries the possibility of finding something that mentions Sun Tzu. That provides one more piece of the puzzle. Until then, Sun Tzu remains what he perhaps always wanted to be, a mystery, a ghost who changed the world and left almost no trace of his passing. Segment 4. Power, Glory, and the World They Left Behind. To understand Sun Tzu's true legacy, we must step back from the individual and examine the world he operated in, a world where power was concentrated in royal courts, where aristocratic elites made decisions that determined the fate of millions, and where the common soldier's suffering was merely a calculation in strategies devised by men who never held a spear. The kings and aristocrats of the spring and autumn period lived in a reality utterly divorced from the warriors they commanded. While Sun Tzu and his soldiers marched through mud and slept in frozen camps, the rulers who sent them to war resided in elaborate palace complexes that were essentially miniature cities. These palaces were not just residences but centers of administration, ritual performance, and conspicuous consumption designed to project power. King Helu of Wu, Sun Tzu's patron, ruled from a palace complex in what is now Suzhou. Archaeological excavations of similar period palaces reveal structures built on massive earthen platforms, surrounded by multiple walls, containing hundreds of rooms arranged around ceremonial courtyards. The king's personal quarters occupied a small fraction of this space. The rest was devoted to administrative offices, ritual halls, armories, treasuries, and the quarters for the enormous staff required to maintain such an establishment. The contrast with the life of an ordinary soldier could not be more extreme. While Sun Tzu's infantry camped in the field, eating cold millet and sleeping in canvas tents, King Helu dined on elaborate feasts prepared by dozens of cooks, slept in chambers heated by bronze braziers and warmed by silk curtains, and wore robes embroidered with gold thread. This disparity was not hidden or apologized for. It was the natural order, as accepted by commoners as by kings. Yet King Helu, like most rulers of his era, was not simply a decadent tyrant. He was, by necessity, a skilled political operator. The kings of the spring and autumn period ruled not through absolute authority, but through a complex web of relationships with aristocratic families, each of which controlled their own military forces, their own territories, their own networks of clients and dependents. A king who lost the support of these families lost everything. This is why King Helu valued Sun Tzu so highly. Military success was not just about battlefield victory, it was about political survival. Each successful campaign strengthened Helu's position relative to his own aristocracy, demonstrating his competence and increasing his prestige. Defeat would have weakened him domestically even more than internationally, as rival families would have used it as evidence that the throne should pass to someone else. Sun Tzu understood this dynamic intimately. His strategies were never purely military. They always had a political dimension. When he advised avoiding battle unless victory was assured, he was thinking not just about casualties, but about the political cost of defeat. When he emphasized the importance of intelligence gathering, he was recognizing that information is power in court politics as much as in warfare. The aristocratic class that Sun Tzu came from, and that King Helu relied on, lived lives that were luxurious by the standards of the era but precarious in ways modern people struggle to comprehend. Yes, they had wealth, status, and power. They lived in manor houses, commanded servants, received shares of agricultural production from dependent peasants. But they were always one political mistake away from total ruin. The purge that destroyed Sun Tzu's family and forced him into exile was not exceptional, it was routine. Court politics was warfare by other means, and the casualty rate was sometimes higher. For every Sun Tzu who survived and prospered, there were dozens of aristocratic families that didn't. They backed the wrong faction in a succession dispute. They offended a powerful minister. They simply got unlucky, finding themselves on the losing side of a political realignment they hadn't seen coming. When they fell completely, property confiscated, family executed or enslaved, their names erased from records. Political defeat in the spring and autumn period meant annihilation. This context makes Sun Tzu's philosophy of strategic caution more comprehensible. He lived in a world where a single mistake could mean extinction, not just defeat. The obsessive emphasis in The Art of War on planning, preparation, and avoiding unnecessary risks reflects someone who had seen what failure cost. He had watched his own family destroyed. He had no illusions about second chances. The common soldiers, of course, had even less protection. They were conscripted from the peasant population, torn away from their farms during planting or harvest season, marched to distant battlefields, and returned, if they returned, maimed, traumatized, or simply exhausted. Their families received no compensation. Their sacrifices were not memorialized. They were the expendable resource that kingdoms consumed in their endless competitions for dominance. Sun Tzu's strategic philosophy, for all its brilliance, operated within this system without fundamentally challenging it. He sought to minimize casualties, yes, but primarily because soldiers were expensive and difficult to replace, not because of humanitarian concern. He advocated for quick campaigns because prolonged warfare disrupted agricultural production and could cause famine, not because he was troubled by human suffering. This isn't a moral criticism. It would be anachronistic to expect a Bronze Age military strategist to have modern humanitarian values. But it's important to recognize that Sun Tzu's The Art of War is a text written by and for elites, offering strategies for how rulers and generals could manage their human resources more efficiently. Yet despite operating within this brutal system, Sun Tzu's ideas contain seeds of something transformative. His insistence that the best victory is one where no battle is fought challenged the warrior culture that dominated his era. In a society where military prowess was the highest virtue, where heroes were celebrated for their courage in combat, Sun Tzu argued that fighting itself was a failure of strategy. This was a radically subversive idea, even if Sun Tzu himself probably didn't intend it as social critique. This tension between the conservative application of his ideas and their radical implications would play out across centuries. Later generations would read The Art of War and see in it different meanings. Some rulers used it to justify aggression, citing Sun Tzu's advocacy for deception and surprise attacks. Others used it to justify pacifism, pointing to his statements about avoiding warfare when possible. The text was flexible enough to support almost any interpretation, which is part of why it survived. After Sun Tzu's death, the state of Wu continued to apply his strategies with considerable success for another generation. King Helu's son Fuchai inherited not just a throne but a military system that had been transformed by Sun Tzu's methods. Wu continued its expansion, briefly becoming the dominant power in the region. But ultimately, Wu fell. In 473 BCE, just a few decades after Sun Tzu's death, Wu was conquered and absorbed by its rival Yu. The specific strategies that had made Wu successful were studied and countered by its enemies. This illustrates a crucial limitation of strategic knowledge. Once revealed, it loses effectiveness. Sun Tzu's methods worked brilliantly when Wu was the only state employing them. Once other states adopted similar approaches, Wu lost its advantage. The larger lesson is that no strategic insight, no matter how brilliant, can permanently secure a state's position. Power is always temporary. Advantage is always fleeting. This is perhaps the deepest truth in the art of war, the one that underlies all the tactical advice, that the world is fundamentally unstable, that change is constant, and that the strategist's job is not to establish permanent security, but to navigate continuous uncertainty. As the spring and autumn period transitioned into the warring states period, warfare itself evolved. The conflicts became larger in scale, more ruthless in execution, more totalized in their aims. The measured, ritualized battles of Sun Tzu's era gave way to campaigns of annihilation where entire populations were enslaved or massacred. Sun Tzu's ideas about limiting casualties and ending wars quickly became increasingly irrelevant as generals pursued total victory regardless of cost. Yet the text survived this transformation, adapting to new contexts. During the Han Dynasty, which finally unified China in 206 BCE, the art of war was studied as a classical text, part of the intellectual heritage that educated officials were expected to master. Commentators added layers of interpretation, connecting Sun Tzu's strategic principles to Confucian ethics, Taoist philosophy, and the bureaucratic requirements of imperial administration. The text became something different from what Sun Tzu had written, not just a military manual, but a general guide to managing conflict in any context. This process of reinterpretation and expansion continued across centuries. Buddhist monks read Sun Tzu and found principles applicable to spiritual warfare against delusion and attachment. Japanese samurai read him and integrated his ideas into Bushido, the warrior code. Chinese revolutionaries in the 20th century, including Mao Zedong, studied Sun Tzu and found principles applicable to guerrilla warfare and political mobilization. Each generation found in the art of war what it needed to find. This malleability is sometimes criticized as evidence that the text is so vague it means nothing. But perhaps it's better understood as evidence of genuine insight, that Sun Tzu identified principles abstract enough to transcend his specific context, yet concrete enough to be useful. The modern legacy of Sun Tzu is complex and sometimes contradictory. The art of war has been translated into dozens of languages and sells millions of copies annually. It is assigned reading at military academies, business schools, and management seminars. Strategic studies programs analyze it alongside Clausewitz and modern game theory. Corporate executives quote it in presentations, often without understanding the historical context or the original meaning. This popularization has inevitably led to dilution and misuse. Management consultants extract pithy quotes and present them as business wisdom without acknowledging that Sun Tzu was writing about literal warfare where the stakes were death and enslavement. Self-help gurus repackage strategic principles as life advice without recognizing the moral ambiguity inherent in a text that advocates deception and manipulation. Yet despite these distortions, something essential continues to resonate. Sun Tzu's core insights, that conflict can be managed through careful preparation, that intelligence is more valuable than force, that the best victories are those that avoid confrontation, that flexibility is more important than rigid planning. These remain relevant because they address fundamental aspects of human competition and cooperation. In the end, Sun Tzu's greatest legacy may not be any specific strategy or tactic, but rather an approach to thinking about conflict itself. He demonstrated that warfare is not primarily about courage, honor, or martial virtue, but about systematic analysis, careful planning, and the rational allocation of resources. This was a revolutionary idea in his time, and in some ways it remains revolutionary today, in an era where we still often romanticize conflict and valorize violent confrontation. The monuments to Sun Tzu are not physical structures, but intellectual traditions. There is no grand tomb, no temple complex, no tourist site claiming to be his birthplace. Instead, his memorial is the continued study of strategic thinking, the recognition across cultures and centuries that conflict can be analyzed rationally, that violence is often avoidable, that wisdom is more powerful than force. In a small museum in Suzhou, not far from where King Helu's palace once stood, there is an exhibit about Sun Tzu. It contains replicas of spring and autumn period weapons, maps showing the territories of ancient Wu, and various editions of The Art of War in different languages. The centerpiece is a quote from the text, presented in both classical Chinese and English translation. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Visitors from around the world stand before this exhibit, taking photos, discussing the meaning of the quote. They are business people and soldiers, students and tourists, people who have come to pay homage to a man who lived 2,500 years ago and who changed how humanity thinks about conflict. Most of them know almost nothing about the real Sun Tzu, the refugee who fled political purges, the soldier who marched through mud and blood, the strategist who executed his employer's concubines to prove a point about discipline. They know the legend, not the man, and perhaps that's appropriate. Sun Tzu understood better than most that reputation is more important than reality, that perception shapes outcomes more than facts, that the story told about you after you die matters more than the life you actually lived. He would probably be amused, or perhaps satisfied, to know that he has become a legend, a wise sage dispensing timeless wisdom, a military genius who never lost, a philosopher-warrior who transcended his era. The truth, as always, is more complex and more human. Sun Tzu was a product of his time, a man shaped by violence and political chaos, whose insights came not from abstract meditation, but from bitter experience. He survived when many others didn't, not because he was invulnerable, but because he was adaptable. He succeeded not because he was the strongest or the bravest, but because he understood something that most of his contemporaries missed, that in a world of constant conflict, the ultimate skill is knowing when not to fight. That lesson, born in the blood and mud of ancient China, remains relevant. The kingdoms Sun Tzu served have long since vanished. The battles he won have been forgotten except by specialists. The specific tactics he employed are obsolete, rendered irrelevant by 25 centuries of technological change. But the principle endures, that wisdom is more powerful than force, that preparation defeats improvisation, that understanding defeats strength. These are not just military lessons. They are lessons about how to live in a world that remains, despite all our progress, fundamentally shaped by conflict, competition, and the struggle for survival. Sun Tzu's world of warring kingdoms has become our world of competing nations, corporations, ideologies. The weapons have changed, but the dynamics remain remarkably similar. We still face adversaries. We still compete for limited resources. We still must decide when to fight and when to yield, when to attack and when to defend, how to achieve our objectives while minimizing costs. In that sense, Sun Tzu never died. His body returned to the earth 25 centuries ago, in an unmarked grave in a kingdom that no longer exists. But his mind, his insights, his strategic wisdom, these live on, transmitted through text and tradition, adapted and reinterpreted by each new generation, remaining relevant because the fundamental challenges of human conflict remain unchanged. This is the ultimate victory, not conquering territory or destroying enemies, but achieving a kind of immortality through ideas. Sun Tzu would probably appreciate the irony. He spent his life avoiding unnecessary battles, minimizing casualties, seeking victories that didn't require fighting. In the end, he won the greatest victory of all. He conquered time itself, becoming one of those rare historical figures whose influence actually increases the further we move from their era. The world Sun Tzu left behind is not just the political landscape of ancient China, transformed by his military campaigns. It is the entire subsequent history of strategic thinking, shaped by his insights. Generals from Napoleon to Mao studied his work. Strategists from Clausewitz to modern game theorists built upon his foundations. Business leaders and politicians, and anyone facing competitive challenges, have found wisdom in his words. And yet, for all this influence, we still barely know him. The man himself remains a shadow, obscured by time and legend. We have his text and a few fragmentary biographical details, but the human being, what he loved, what he feared, what he dreamed about in those frozen military camps, that remains forever inaccessible. Perhaps that's the final lesson Sun Tzu offers. The greatest strategist conceals himself so thoroughly that even history cannot find him. He achieves his objectives and leaves no trace. He changes the world and remains invisible. That is the supreme art, not of war, but of life itself.